Hey everyone, my name is Amanda and I'm the Fun Size Reader, and today I'm doing a video that has been a long time coming. I want to talk about books that you can read to start getting into the fantasy genre. I get messages all the time, from people who are like, hey, I've never read fantasy before. I want to start reading fantasy. What should I read? And I have a very specific opinion on this. I feel like a lot of people start reading fantasy because they see A Court of Thorns and Roses everywhere. So because they see A Court of Thorns and Roses everywhere and everyone says, oh my gosh, it's amazing, and they rave about it, it is. I've read it many times. As I've told you guys before, and I'm sure you have heard in my other videos, I read A Court of Thorns and Roses when it first came out. Like literally only book one was published. So I read it and I loved it and it was amazing, and I had to wait for all the rest of them. But because I had to do that and I couldn't just read the whole amazing series back to back to back to back to back, I got to read other fantasy. I'm very opinionated on this. I think that when a lot of people want to get started into fantasy, the worst thing they can do is read the best first. Because I get so many people that tell me, I read all of Sarah J. Maas's books, I'm in a massive book hole, and now everything that I read afterwards sucks. That's what happens when you read the best. You read the best first, and then you are comparing everything else to the best. There is no question that I have said for many, many years that Sarah is the queen of fantasy. Brandon Sanderson is the king, Sarah is the queen. Like, that's just the way it is in our generation. So if you read the most amazing first, you're not gonna like broaden what you've read. Because there are so many great fantasy books, fantasy series out there. And I think a lot of people get them ruined for them because they only read one thing first. And then they say, well, I'm a fantasy reader, I'm now gonna go read a bunch of other fantasy, and they don't like it as much. So I recommend starting with other fantasy books first and getting your feet wet in fantasy, learning how to world build, because it's very different reading a fantasy book and building the world in your brain as you read than it is reading a thriller that's set in the real world, reading contemporary romance, YA romance, like everything that's set in the real world. We don't have to build that. Like, we just learn the characters, we learn what's going on in that time, that place, whatever. But world building is like a very specific skill. And so I wanted to bring you guys a list of YA books because, like I said, I get asked this a lot and I always recommend to start with YA. YA fantasy books that I read around the time that I read the first book of The Court of Thorns and Roses, because I couldn't read all the rest of them yet. And so like these books kind of jump-started me into being a fantasy reader. And so I wanted to share them with you guys for anybody who is new to fantasy or just looking for something different than A Court of Thorns and Roses. So the first one, actually, I did not read when I was getting into fantasy. I read it after I was like a well-versed fantasy reader. So that being said, I did not love this series, but people who do read this series early in their fantasy reading career love it. And so that's why I put it on this list, and that is Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. I think this is a great series to like get started in fantasy worlds, powers, magic, loving a villain. Like, there's so many things that are in this series that like sets you up for the way fantasy books are. I was not like head over heels over this because I read it after I was a well-versed fantasy reader, but people who start with this series and like the Grishaverse in general love it. So definitely one that I recommend. I did like the series. I haven't finished the last one. I haven't finished the last one yet. But I did like it. I just didn't love it. I have not read the other Grishaverse books because I haven't finished this full series yet. And I did really like the show. So if you haven't watched the show yet, watch the show, but read the book first because it does help make more sense. Like my husband got the show and it's, you know, you can get the show, but I helped explain some things because I had read the books. Read the book, watch the show. It's on Netflix. The next series is one that I loved. I loved. It is I believe it's 4 books, but then there's like some novellas and prequels and stuff like that. But I read this one and loved it. And when I was, again, starting early fantasy, I had other people in my family, my sister, my sister-in-law, who are also starting early fantasy, and they loved these books as well. And that they're older, but they just got new covers, and I still think like the content and the fantasy world and all of that is just one of my favorites of all time. And that is Cinder by Marissa Meyer. Like I said, I have the old covers. They're all retellings of fairy tales, which is another reason why I was really drawn to them. So they're retellings of fairy tales in a fantasy world, in this like world that it's not real. There's like cyclopses and machines and stuff. It's kind of like weirdly a mix of Star Wars and fairy tales. Each book introduces a different character. So obviously the first one is Cinder, Cinderella. The second one is Scarlet and it's Red Riding Hood. The third one is Cress and it is Rapunzel. And the fourth one is Winter and it's Snow White. So like all of them get fed into the whole story. It's not like each book is different. You just meet a new person. And they're just really fun. Most of these, pretty much all of these, they're steamy books. They can have steamy moments, but they're not really spicy. So these were as well. And I loved them. I loved them a lot. And I would definitely recommend these, especially if you're like a Disney lover or you just love retellings with like a sci-fi fantasy spin on them. Check out Cinder. Okay, so the next one is like one of my favorite YA fantasy series. I love recommending this series. I just think it was so well done. There's romance and just like intrigue and magic and just so many things all strewn in, and it's just addicting. It was so addicting. And that is Caraval by Stephanie Garber. I love recommending this series. It's a 2 sisters series, so you have like their relationship. And the first book is from one perspective, and the second book switches to the other's perspective. And the third, I can't remember. I think it's stays with the second one. It might switch. I don't remember. It's about a game. It's about kind of like a carnival that comes into town and you can only go by invite, and Master Legend, who runs Caraval, is like elusive and nobody knows who he really is. And the whole book is like what is real and what's part of the game. And it was so good, you guys. It's so good. I love this book. I love this book so much. My sister-in-law actually, I think I got her the first one for Christmas one year, and she read it with like 10 minutes before the bookstore closed, and she legitimately jumped in her car and went to the bookstore in pajamas and ran in to get books 2 and 3 because she was like, I just need to keep reading them. Caraval, read Caraval. It's so good. And I know so many people who read it after, like right after they read Sarah J. Maas, and they're like, oh, that was not that great. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean? So yeah, that's why I said what I said in the beginning. The next one is The Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard. I loved this series. I know there's a lot of people who are disappointed in the ending of the series, but there's a lot of people that like it. I liked it. There was a slight twinge of disappointment for one specific reason, but like overall I thought the series was great. I again had to wait for each one to get published, and they get bigger as they go, but this is like a perfect fantasy, getting to know magic, getting to know like the royalty, the battles, the building, like it has it all. I like this one because I think it gives you a good introduction to a main character that sometimes you kind of hate. Like, you kind of get mad at Meyer. And at least I did. I don't know if everybody did. But there were some times where you found yourself siding with the villain, and other times that you hated him. And then there were times where you were just like, wanted to smack Meyer. And I think that it made it really real, but in a fantasy world. I don't know. I just really enjoyed these books. They are steamy. They do have like some steam as they go on, but nothing that is explicit. So like, it's good for any age. The last one is The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. And this is again a series that I really enjoyed. I did read this more into my fantasy career, so I did want a little bit more world building from it, or like depth. I think I wanted just more depth because it was very good and I really enjoyed it, and I loved the like love to hate each other relationship that's in this book with Carden and Jude. I also really loved that it was kind of you got the human world and a fantasy fae world, so that was really helpful in like the world building exercise. It is a 3-book series. It is finished, so like it's easy to just, you know, binge through this. Pretty much all of the ones that I've recommended, they're all finished. So these are great. They're all finished. You can just read them straight through. They weren't all finished when I read them. This one is really great because it's like mortal, fae. You get that interaction between the human and the magic, which is like really prevalent in fantasy books, but it's not too extravagant or confusing or whatever. It's just enjoyable. So yeah, check out The Cruel Prince. There's a lot of fan art for The Cruel Prince too. I see it all the time. So that's kind of my fantasy starter pack. That these are the things that I recommend to people who are wanting to get into fantasy. Now, if you have already read A Court of Thorns and Roses at the beginning, like that doesn't mean that you can't go and read all of these. But I do caution people who have done that, and like you have to let that go a little bit. Because it's just so popular and so everywhere, and everybody has all of these emotions towards that series. And if you're so sucked into that and you just compare everything without even trying to, like you do, it happens. I just caution you that you won't enjoy other things. Not saying that you won't ever, but like there's so many fantasy books out there, and there's so many great YA, NA, adult fantasy books that I've heard so many people give negative feedback just because they read it after A Court of Thorns and Roses. And it makes me sad because they don't deserve that. So I hope if you're new to fantasy, you stick around on my page because I read a lot of it and I recommend a lot of it. Hopefully these will get you started. And if you aren't new to fantasy and you're just looking for more recommendations, here are some, and I've got tons of others. I will put the link for all of these books and these series down in the description below. And don't forget, you can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Fun Size Reader. See you guys next time.